Hello, I'm Fizzy Spider. First I'm going to just apologize for the poor lighting, and then I want to give you a few tips on ways that you can draw, even if you are only if it's just you and you want to draw a character, and yet you want someone to be your reference. And that is, this is how I usually do reference images anyway. Is instead of reference images, I just try to figure out the pose myself. Now, here's a few tips when you're trying to do that style of, well, modeling. You being the model. First of all, you gotta understand not every body type can do all the different articulations that your body type can. Like, I'm a fairly skinny guy. I can probably have a lot more range of motion than someone with a little more heft on their body. Thus, you have to think of that when you are trying to pose for a character that has a different body type than yourself. Along with that, you want to look at, let's say you're doing an armed character. Let's say the character you're doing wields something along the lines of a bow. You want to make sure that, let's say your character is right-handed, since I'm right-handed, I want to assume the character that I draw is right-handed. Thus, I try to determine what pose am I in, where is the camera placed. So let's say I'm drawing, camera's there, and the character's aiming at the camera. I want to make sure that I draw the bow in front of me, and I go a lot more detail in the hand, make sure that the leading hand is bigger, and it always helps if you can get a prop. Even if that prop is literally just some toy that you bought from Walmart or McDonald's toy, even if it's like a small toy knife or something. Just make sure if you don't have props, just pretend it is there. Make sure you think about, alright, this is based on your previous knowledge of that item. And if you are going to do invisible prop, at least do some research on what your invisible prop is. Like, if I'm holding like a pole arm of some sort, I want to make sure that I keep my hands as lined up the best I can, because realistically, a pole arm is going to have your hands there. Now, I'm only talking for characters that wield weapons. This could also work for unarmed characters as well. And if you're doing characters that have things like sheaths, try to find something like this is literally just the collapsible handle out of a backpack, but this is really good for doing like sheath poses, because I can unsheath, I can hold it in different ways, and like different sheathing methods and blade wielding methods, and just all sorts of different stuff. Excuses it's all metal, but that allows me to do things like katanas and such. With that just makes things that are similar to this in the actual arms area. When it comes to arms, armed weapons are sheathed. Like, if I were to do that generic unsheathing the sword pose, along with that, I left the collapsibility, so let's say I want to do that whole unsheathing the sword thing, I can get a feel for what that pose would be like. For that's ultimately what you're going for. You're going for how is your body acting to the pose, and what position your limbs are. For example, let's say, let's come over here, grab my hook. Let's say I have a character who's resting a hook style weapon on their shoulder. And to say that chain. Now, if you do things like chains, try and get them out of the way unless they are part of the pose. And try to stick with invisible. Like, don't just use imaginary chains and such for chains and whips. For chain and whip poses. Just make sure you track the direction the chain or whip is going. But now let's say I have a character that wields a scythe. They have their scythe rested on their shoulder, spiky point their hook aimed it down. I try to find the most natural position for my hands while also thinking, alright, that's now a blade. This is clearly not a blade in any sense of the word. But I pretend, hey, now that's a blade. I think, hey, that's now a blade. That now sharp. Just think it's sharp, but it's not actually sharp. And I determine, alright, this is what a good Wrathguard kind of balanced on my shoulder pose would be. RP, I'm not a professional martial artist, and I am not a professional artist or drawing instructor of any kind. It's just, this is how I do it, and I want to show you guys how I do it. That way, you guys could take advantage of it in your own works. Now, along with that, you want to look at what kind, this is a cane I made. It's a fairly simple, collapsible cane. Like, if I were to tilt the camera down, I can get that whole kind of uppity, proper pose. But due to the fact the way I designed it, I can actually do sword poses. I like to do it more like this, just due to the fact that, well, there's a lot of handle there. That's the sword. But I can easily, just due to the way it's shaped and weighted, I could easily pull off one-handed swordsman poses. Yeah, I have to worry about that handle, and, well, there's not enough room for me to really demonstrate inside, but yeah. And when you are doing things that are going to represent swords and such, if you can get something that's weighted correctly, do so. Now, this ain't weighted anywhere correctly for a sword, but is balanced correctly. This is a good example of what you're looking at. This is literally just a bunch of pieces of scrap metal slapped together that I made originally to be a collapsible cane, and then I was like, then I happen to see the wrench and put a cross guard on it, a pseudo cross guard. Now, if you have a character that wields a dual guarded sword, which I don't get why a character would have so many cross guards on one sword, but let's say you have a character that does, you can now try and figure out how would that sword be wielded. Could it be wielded one-handed? What positions could it go in? And the reason I went for this is, well, it's a cane. This was built as a cane first, but due to the way it's set up, I can easily emulate basically things like just grabbing the blade of the sword and smashing into enemies, which, according to Skullgrim, Shadowversity, and a few other swordsmanship YouTubers, as well as several other, and their sources, which are primarily historical documents, which they do show and credit. I can't remember any of them off the top of my head, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But it was historically accurate for swordsmen to just grab their sword blade and smash their enemies with it, or half sword, which I'd see is perfectly viable with this. Now, if you have access to things like cardboard, wood, cardboard, metal, and the correct equipment to manipulate those materials, take advantage of it. Make your props. Like I made this in a metals class, and then proceeded afterwards to lock the pin in place with a bunch of old string. So if you have cardboard and a pair of scissors and a pencil, boom, you can now make props. And if you have paracord duct tape or something to beef up the handle and the guard and such, like multiple layers, you could do it. Now, when it comes to that, make sure you're trying to make it for when you're building props in general, building and or scavenging for props, because some of these are scavenged things, some of these are things I made in class, in woods and art classes. Like this is a bow I made in my woodshop class as a project. And yeah, when you're making props of any kind, be it the representation of an arm, a piece of weaponry, or even something as simple as a shield, you want to make sure that, well, whatever you're making, like if you are making it in a school setting, make sure you have permission from your teacher and, well, you have the correct permissions and all that to do so. But if you're making it at your own place, you have to look at what materials do I got, what skills do I got, and what is my character wielding, and what is the character like? Who is my character? Like, you don't want to go in and say, ooh, that's a pretty sword. I want to remake that sword. And then you turn around, you remake the sword in cardboard, because that's a fairly easy to get a hold of material. You remake it in cardboard and duct tape. And then boom, you have a sword. But the problem is, you then realize you have no clue how it would be wielded, who would wield it, or why they are wielding that. So you want to make sure you have all your details settled before you make your prop. Because if you don't have your details settled when you make your prop, you are now just taking up space in your house for the prop. Now, it's not like you can't just make a prop to make a prop. You may make the prop, forget you made it, have it set aside, come up with the character that would really work for that prop. So, I'm not saying don't just randomly make props, but I'm also saying try avoiding it if you have no desire to actually have a character wield a weapon like that, or wield that kind of prop or item. And along with that, make sure you keep track of what you're doing, why you're doing it, who you're doing it for. Because, again, everything's different. Like, let's say you have a character sitting in a wheelchair. I don't think they'd be wielding a pole arm or a long-bladed sword. They'd probably be wielding either a ranged weapon, or a weapon or a thrusting weapon. A thrusting weapon that can easily be stored on a wheelchair, like a knife, a small spear, and the like. I'm gonna go back to standing. And let's say you have a character who's on crutches, or has some other issue along those lines. Like, let's say you have a character who's on, let's just use the crutches idea. I don't think they'd be wielding something that would be two-handed, because they need one hand to balance their crutches. Let's just assume that my cane here is a crutch. They need one hand to hold the crutch. So going for something like a one-handed sword, again, a small one-handed spear for thrusting and such. Ranged weapons like firearms and the like. But you have a character that's very distinguished and wish not carry an obvious weapon. Boom. Weaponize their cane. I'm gonna go mainly for weaponized characters because that's mainly what I personally draw. Now, just feel free to explore your possibilities and all that. You want to turn around, go really quickly. And that's about it on that subject. Here's Roger. Goodbye.